Michael Morris, Director of Transportation here at the North Central Texas Council of Governments. Thank you so much and welcome to Eye on Politics.
Oh, thank you very much. It's nice to see you again.
So let's talk about this House Bill 3187 that would really change the way DART is funded. How big of a concern is this to you and why?
It's a big concern to us, both as staff and the Regional Transportation Council. We very much understand the frustration the legislature has. We understand the frustration DART has, and we very much understand the frustration that the local governments have that are members of DART. Obviously, there needs to be a solution. We initiated a year ago what we call Transit 2.0, which is the next 20 years of the transportation authorities. They just celebrated a few years ago their first 40 years. So when you're building a system and now rotating to operating a system, you start to see the concerns that have been raised by the legislature and by the member governments. So we think the transit agencies need to rotate to more of a operational feel. We think there does need to be legislative change. I just don't think this is the legislative change that's in the best interest of the region going out to 2050. I'll give you an example. Today, roughly half of the population sits inside the 3 transportation authorities. With the new demographic forecast, it falls to like 37%. So as we move from 8 million to 12 million people, I need transit as a tool for all 12 million people. And the demographic forecasts aren't aligned with the original founding cities of the transit agency. So we need to expand these boundaries. I think the DART cities are carrying too heavy a load at a penny. Not everyone is putting into the transit vision. The state, is somewhat schizophrenic when it comes to transit. So I think we have to remember we're at 8.5 million people. We're not at 3 million people when the transit agencies were formed. And my job is to start acting like we're 12.5 million people, because the Metropolitan Planning Organization has to plan for 2050. In 2050, we're going to need transit in the whole region. So I'm not sure this is the right answer to the concern, and we're prepared to develop that answer for the next legislative session.
So you've said a lot, so let's break it down a little bit.
We've been a little occupied on this topic.
So let's go back, because this bill currently, which you don't support, would allow cities like Plano, which has really been at the forefront of this legislation, pushing for it, would allow cities to take 25% back of their sales tax revenue to DART.
Right.
And DART is having a fit over this, obviously. And but the cities say, look, it's not working for them because they've overpaid, and they've said basically that they're subsidizing Dallas. So what would your method be when you say you want to expand, the transit agencies? I mean, what does that look like?
So our official position, and I don't want to mince words, our official position is this issue should have been resolved at home. It shouldn't have been brought to the legislature. That's the RTC's position. And the RTC is said, we funded Transit 2.0 for a reason. Why don't we implement a new legislative solution using the fundamental principles of Transit 2.0? So I want to be careful, as a staff person, we can't oppose the legislation, but we don't think it's the right place for the conversation to be resolved, and it's not nearly as comprehensive than what we need. So let's take the issue a city says, look, I'm paying into DART, and we're looking at the data from 2023, which is the data that they're using, and we've added up our amount of transit service and how much we're paying in, and we're basically overpaying for the services that we're getting. So what should happen in that particular situation? The first thing is you should size the transit services for what the community needs, which I don't think has happened in Plano. They need more micro transit, similar to Arlington. They need more circulator systems. They need some ability to have more competitive transit, so the car and transit are closer in competition. They may or may not need as many fixed bus routes as they have. So there's a sensitivity that has to occur to determine the appropriate transit response for the community, as requested by the city. These are things City of Plano has requested. The other thing, and I don't want to get too technical, 2023 happens to be a year before the Silver Line gets implemented. The Silver Line is ready to open in the next few months. The cost of the Silver Line to build, the cost of the debt service, and the cost to operate should be somehow charged its portion to Plano. Well, it wasn't in 2023 because the Silver Line wasn't in operation. So if you redo the math for 2025 or 2026 or 2027, you're not going to get the same answer. So if you pick in a bad sample size, hey, I'm getting hurt by 25%, and your solution isn't to fix it for a year, it's to fix it forever, well, it's really not a fair path forward. Since the Silver Line, everyone's worked hard to get the Silver Line funded, the RTC helped get it funded, lots of debates in Dallas for 2 decades with regard to the particular service and the amenities that should be put in. We're finally there, and we're not celebrating the Silver Line. We're looking at data from 2023 to say, hey, we're not getting our fair share.
And let's remind everybody what the Silver Line is. It's a rail service from Plano that goes to DFW Airport.
All the way to DFW, actually it goes all the way to Fort Worth.
Fort Worth.
So you could actually wake up in Fort Worth and go to Plano, or Plano to the airport, or Plano to Grapevine, or so it's a hair disingenuous. So when you have the conversation in the region, which the Regional Transportation Council, you could get into these particular discussions in mediation. I'm not sure all the parties wanted to mediate it. I think some parties said, you know what, we'll take our chances with the legislature and see if we can solve it there. So I think it would be best if the legislature sends the issue back to the region, directly or indirectly. We've specifically asked for a direct instruction. Hey, Dallas-Fort Worth, go solve this issue and bring it back to us.
Didn't they say that 2 years ago?
Well, I mean in a formal piece of legislation. Actually pass a local consensus bill and have it as a formal instruction. But
so a different bill.
With or without an instruction, we're prepared at the Regional Transportation Council to fix this particular problem back at home. And I think we got to bring in the legislative delegation from our region, all the transportation authorities, all the local governments that are paying into the transportation authorities, all the cities that are interested in getting some transit that aren't part of an authority. But if you look at the boundaries from 1980, there were probably reasonable boundaries in 1980. When I overlap the demographics of 2050 on these boundaries, which have not changed any material way in 43 years, we got to expand these boundaries. We got to bring transit. It may not be rail for everybody, maybe it's microtransit, some level of transit implementation. We need a better transit solution than what we got now.
But don't cities have to buy into that?
Well, it depends on how you want to move forward. You can continue the current operation of saying, okay, you need city vote-in. You can come up with other mechanisms that are used in other parts of the United States and convince a legislature of a different mechanism potentially. I'm not here to design the boundary or the process, other than we need to be prepared to do a much better job on delivering a transit system and a transit institutional structure for 12.5 million people than to just simply go back and say, well, DART, you should have done something sooner, 6 years ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago. That may be true, but that isn't necessarily the best solution for what we really need.
It almost sounds like you're calling for a transportation summit for North Texas, and fast.
We are at a crossroads. If you look at the new demographic forecasts, Lots of conversations we can get into on why it's so suburban and rural, and how developers can go to unincorporated areas of county and be able to develop without any real rules like you have in cities. Developers have gotten smart, and it's a lot easier to, build your units in a place where you don't have to go to a planning and zoning commission than to, develop what you think is in the best interest of your private market. So I don't know if it's a transportation summit. It's definitely a transit / high-speed rail summit to really prepare a region for 12.5 million people.
And my last question on this topic before we get to high-speed rail, and that is, you keep mentioning 12 million. When is that going to happen?
So we're growing right now at about 250,000 persons a year. So we used to, when you interviewed me a decade ago, we were growing at 1 million people a decade. Then like 2 years ago, we started saying 1 million people every 7 years. Now it's like 1 million people every 5 or 6 years at 250,000 people a year. The board will receive this next population estimate next week. So we'll see what it is. Last year was 250,000. So we're growing at 1 million people every 5 to 6 years. So we're at 8.5. We think there's 4 more million people coming by 2050. So in 20, 25 years, we'll grow another 50%. And just think of all that demographic activity that doesn't have a transit option, overloading an already congested roadway system. The horse is getting out of the barn, and we got to get the horse back in the barn. We got to get cities and transportation authorities laser focused on land use and developments around our rail stations and reinvest in that land use around those stations. The hard part's been done. Stations are built. The vision that I think is critical for our office to get across is we can save a whole bunch of money in a whole bunch of different modes by coordinating transit and local government land use and private sector development, where a greater share, not everybody, but a greater share locates around our rail stations.
Let's talk about high-speed rail. After the Trump administration basically canceled this nearly $64 million planning grant for the proposed Dallas to Houston high-speed rail line, is this project dead?
I don't think so. In fact, I think it's the opposite.
Why?
That's a very good question. I believe the private sector wishes to take the lead again like it was originally conceived. So the private sector had the ball. The Japanese technology was brought in. It was environmentally cleared with the Japanese technology. Japan hit the pause switch with regard to their particular interest.
Their funding.
Their funding, is it still needed? There's a very compelling story that we need to talk about on why Japan is interested in the United States in high-speed rail, and it's related to their national security and making sure the United States government is there for them if it is ever needed. Ambassador Schieffer tells a very compelling story when he was ambassador to Japan. So Japan rethinks its strategy and need with regard to that. Texas Central Partners gets frustrated. For 2 or 3 years, they're on hold. Amtrak sees an opportunity as our national railroad to step in. Amtrak was a partner to help establish an operator for the investment. I think Amtrak was moving very nicely through the corridor identification program with the Federal Railroad Administration, which is the funds they received. I think the private sector original partners wish to hand the ball back to the private sector. So I believe they've asked the administration to put Amtrak on hold, return the money, hand the ball back to the private sector, and it'll be really interesting to see where the private sector goes with this particular corridor. Are they coming in to have a fire sale and it is over? I don't think they would work so hard to get control of the project if they weren't working on a revenue strategy to implement high-speed rail between Dallas and Houston. So we'll be setting up meetings, once the legislative session is over. We get some breathing time, probably in the summer, early fall, to find out where all the parties are and what their intention is. But I think it's Texas Central Partners driven by private sector interest. We know Japan is out. We know Amtrak is either out or on hold. The private sector has requested the ball again. So it'll be interesting to see where this administration goes with regard to high-speed rail. Does this administration have an appetite for high-speed rail, maybe driven by the private sector versus by the public sector? We'll just have to see.
There are two bills in the Texas legislature. One of them is advancing that would, put in requirements as far as eminent domain. There's a lot of resistance and opposition, particularly down in the rural areas in southeast Texas on the way down towards Houston from Dallas. And if that bill passes, isn't that going to be a really steep climb to come out of that for any private investors?
I think the bill we're most familiar with, I forget exactly the number, it's a transparency bill where the high-speed rail provider has to disclose who they are and what they're doing. I've worked in government service for 45 years. I think that's a requirement to be involved in the transportation business. So any bill that says you have to be more transparent and more forthcoming with regard to what it is you're doing, I think it's fine, as long as it permits high-speed rail still to be able to be implemented. There's a bill which would be devastating to us because we're working on high-speed rail between Dallas, Arlington, and Fort Worth. In our conversations with people in Austin, the direction was stay on public sector land. The issue you're hearing in Grimes County is you're on private sector land. So we're like 97% on public sector land between Fort Worth and Dallas. And where is that? It's on Interstate 30. Well, Interstate 30 between Arlington and downtown Fort Worth is the original toll road, 70 years old. So we are in design right now, putting high-speed rail and the freeway together in the same corridor. So there's a bill that says, hey, you can't be coordinating roadway improvements with high-speed rail improvements. That would be devastating to us, and I think contradictory to this notion that high-speed rail maybe should be more on public sector land or in Class 1 railroad land and less in private sector individual homeowner properties because of the backlash that has come from the Houston to Dallas. So if it's about transparency of high-speed rail companies, who they are and what they're doing and how they pay their property taxes and where they are on eminent domain, I think government, has the right to have transparency for its citizens. But I don't think if there's a bill that says, well, we're going to come up with some strategy to make it almost impossible to build high-speed rail, I think that's a problem. And it gets back to the same position. If Dallas is at, 12 and a half, Houston's at 12, Austin, San Antonio's at probably 10, how are you going to move in a region of 35 to 40 million people in the largest gross domestic product probably in the United States without some backbone of high-speed rail? It just seems impossible to me.
Let me ask you, because the question has come up, at least on the Dallas to Houston proposal, what's the market for it? I mean, is it economically feasible? I've read, and I don't know if it's true, that the costs have climbed from 10 billion to 40 billion. Is that accurate? And how do you pay for that? And how much do you charge customers to go? Because if it's more expensive than just catching a flight, how marketable would that be?
So I don't know exactly what the capital cost is, but I think you're right. We're funding a lot of transportation projects in the region, and prices are going through the roof with regard to it. Remember, high-speed rail has a design life of about 100 years. And we always focus on high-speed rail with regard to the equity impact that it has on individuals versus, say, the rural area hates it, but the urban areas like it because it's a benefit to the urban area. So it's an equity play. Or we jump to the cost and say, well, how is this feasible? The transportation project will be funded, I think, largely by the private sector. So I wonder if, if you look at how roadways are built, there's never enough gas tax generated on a roadway to support a roadway. Roadways are system funded. They're funded through a whole system of revenues that are collected, in our case, 2 propositions: vehicle registration fees, state gasoline tax, and federal gasoline tax, 5 buckets of money. But you could never justify a freeway based on the revenue that's collected on the freeway. It's based on the revenue that's collected in the system, and you pick what is the most important project. Everyone jumps on what the fare would be. What drives high-speed rail investment is really a land use and a transportation play. It's the economic development that occurs, in this case, 3 stations between Dallas and Houston. In our case, 3 stations, Fort Worth, Arlington, and Dallas, where often the investors in the rail system, Las Vegas to Los Angeles, are in the economic development station areas with regard to big buildings, hotels, office buildings, residential, parking revenue. So it's a layered revenue system. In the case of high-speed rail, it's land use and high-speed rail. In the case of roadways, it's 5 or 6 different funding sources to be able to support that particular project. So if the future is really driven by the private sector, which I think is where this is headed, and they develop a revenue stream that's built on a waterfall of revenues from fares and economic development revenue generated near the stations, since we're going to need greater density around our downtowns in the future to survive the other problem we talked about with regard to transit, high-speed rail, it's funny you picked 2 topics, high-speed rail and the DART issue are actually interlinked because it speaks very much to where the land use play has to go. I'm not familiar with Houston's land use. I suspect it's similar, a lot of suburban and rural growth. I got to get, if we're going to succeed, because we're at a crossroads, if we're going to succeed, I got to get a greater land use play around our 80 passenger rail stations and a greater land use play around our 3 downtowns if we're going to be able to sustain 12.5 million people.
What exactly does that mean? You need a greater play of the land use.
So right now, people have forgotten about our 80 stations. It's hard to do developments in the urban core, and these stations maybe were built near industrial areas and other things. So a developer looks at it and says, well, I can easily go to the unincorporated part of a county, which is largely the perimeter counties, because Dallas and Tarrant County are pretty well urbanized with cities. So it ends up, because Dallas and Tarrant County are urbanized, it tends to be a suburban rural play. We need opportunities to make it less difficult for a developer to say, you know what, I'm going to build a really cool mixed-use development around the old Cowboy Stadium, or around like State Farm did in Richardson, or what Grapevine is doing in downtown, where they have a whole economic development density play around a particular rail station, North Richland Hills. Trinity Metro trying to go into the hospital district. If we can do that in 80 areas around the region, and it isn't just about rail, Old Town Louisville, downtown Denton, East Plano, areas that can support, all areas can, but those areas like in our historic suburban downtowns, downtown Arlington, if you've been to downtown Arlington lately, that type of density and creating a walkable community helps us not have to start our car every time we need an aspirin. And with 12.5 million people, we got to think more of how we don't let the horse get out of the barn, meaning a whole bunch of growth that occurs, but we don't have enough transportation money to chase all that particular growth. We have nowhere near the money, as you'll see in the mobility plan, to respond to 12.5 million people in those particular locations, especially when transit isn't even a tool in the toolbox where people could take advantage of a transit trip once in a while.
I have to ask you about the Dallas-Fort Worth high-speed rail proposal. Is that contingent on the Dallas-Houston route?
Most likely. I'm not saying impossible, but a lot of our ridership is picked up from people not wanting to drive all the way to Dallas. They'd rather drive to Arlington or take transit to downtown Fort Worth and get on. So a significant portion of our ridership is between, is the egress mode of the Dallas to Houston play.
So if that doesn't go, if the Dallas-Houston...
It makes it much, much more difficult. I'm not saying impossible, but probably more difficult, because then you're putting too much weight on the economic development play that potentially can occur in Dallas, Arlington, and Fort Worth, and you're not taking advantage of the revenue that's coming off of the egress portion of the Dallas to Houston.
Michael Morris, Director of Transportation at the North Central Texas Council of Governments. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the insight.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I hope it was helpful.
Good to see you.